Slapton Sands, South Devon, a 2-mile-long shingle ridge thrown up over thousands of years by the action of the sea. Behind the ridge is Slapton Lee Nature Reserve, an area of quiet beauty with many rare plants and animals. The main feature is a large freshwater lake, but the reserve also contains a wide variety of different places to live, different habitats, ranging from the open water to reeds, marshes and dense woodland. The aim of the people who look after the reserve is to conserve the habitats and their natural plants and animals. But like many nature reserves today, Slapton is under great pressure. Pressure from us, from people. Local people have been here longer than the reserve, but the trampling feet of thousands of holidaymakers every year are a more recent problem. And the reserve is also busy with other types of visitors. There probably won't be much damage from a few bird watchers, but what about thousands of students on field courses? They might trample and damage the very things they want to study. Fishermen can take boats out onto the lake, yet there is a possibility that the very presence of fishermen might disturb nesting birds. There are a surprising number of conflicts in the nature reserve. For instance, the fishermen themselves are far from happy. The fishing is definitely not what it was.
My family started fishing at Slapton Lee around about 1890. It was at one time called the Mecca of coarse fishers. When I was a boy in the 1950s, the pike fishing was very good, and we would expect to average certainly 5 pike or more a day, and at least one of those would be in double figures. And I myself have had many pike between 15 and 20 pounds. But from reports of anglers, the fishing would appear to be very considerably down.
The changes could be quite natural, or they could be the result of pollution. There's no easy answer. What is clear is that the balance of nature in the underwater world of the Lee is very complicated indeed. If the fishermen are right, the balance in this underwater world has changed significantly in the last few years. The main fish in the Lee are perch, rudd and roach, as well as the pike. The questions are how and why their numbers are changing. And in particular, from the fisherman's point of view, why are big pike now so rare? Some of the answers are slowly being discovered through a detailed study of the balance of nature in the Lee, a study of all its plants and animals, its ecology. Even apparently clear water is teeming with life. These are collections of microscopically small plants. They float around in the water, taking in sunlight and making food. The tiny plants are the source of food for tiny animals, plant-eaters, herbivores. These ferocious-looking insects eat other insects. They're flesh-eaters, carnivores. But they themselves might be eaten by even bigger carnivores, like the perch, and the chain doesn't stop here. The perch are the prey of the much larger pike, the top predator in the lake, the king of this particular jungle. Such food chains are being sorted out by scientists studying the fish population. How do they work?
Well, finding out what fish isn't the real problem. We can employ a number of standard techniques for capture, depending on the species we're after and the time of year.
A net is laid out, starting from the shore, round in a big circle, and back to the shore again.
Just hold on that little bit, all right? Okay, give me the rope then, Rob. All right, let's bring it in if we can.
The fish are trapped inside the circle as the net is pulled in. It's easy to see what type of fish are present, but estimating number is more difficult. It's done by marking these fish and releasing them. When they're caught again, the proportion of marked to unmarked fish can be used to estimate the number. So how do they explain the changes in the fish population?
As far as we can tell from the more recent historical records of the last century, the lake was dominated almost entirely by rudd, perch and pike. And it was recognized as having exceptionally good rudd and very good pike. Now, during the 60s, the roach population expanded enormously until by 1973, there were hardly any rudd in the lake at all, and the roach were dominating. In recent years, since we've been looking at it, we've never found many large pike. There are the odd few, up to about 14 pounds, but the great majority of pike are only 5, 6 pounds, small, very often look as though they're underfed.
Several theories have been put forward to explain why the pike are smaller than they used to be. For instance, pike feed on perch, rudd and roach. But these fish have become much smaller. It's been suggested that the pike find the small fish a very poor source of food. Each one isn't much of a meal for a hungry pike. Another theory is that there are simply too many pike. They compete with each other for food and space. So why can't the Lee be managed to give the fishermen back the big pike they would like?
Because the only way one could begin to approach it is by trying to go back to the conditions of, say, the 1950s, when we knew we had large pike. But we can't do that because the lake has been productive, that you cannot turn the clock back.
There are still a few big pike, but only a few.
Nobody, I think, has the knowledge or the technology to be able to manipulate a whole system to produce large pike at the top. Biology and fisheries is still, I'm afraid, a very inexact science.
So managing the Lee the way the fishermen want may not be possible. And that's just one set of problems in this complicated natural system. Another set relates to the management of the reed beds, as we discovered from Rob Poole.
Well, here we are in Island Bay itself. It's about 60 or 70 metres across, and from the lee to the end of the reed bed is about 260 metres.
Why are the reed beds so important? Why are they considered to be a vital part of the reserve?
Well, the reed beds are a very important area as a sort of quiet spot in the reserve for the animals. It's a very good spot for all the birds, and also for the otter and mink. It's very undisturbed, and also for breeding.
Managing the reed beds isn't easy, partly because it isn't pure reed. Different areas throughout the reed bed have been examined. In each area, the number and type of plants was recorded. The results show a well-known pattern, which starts out in the open water. The plants here are firmly rooted in the bed of the lake, and the whole plant grows underwater. Nearer the shore is a thick forest of lily stems, lilies of leaves which float on the surface. Then come the reeds themselves. Where it's wet, there's reeds and nothing else. But apparently that doesn't last for long.
We're about 40 metres in from the actual reed fringe where the water is. And as you can see, things are still quite wet down here, a lot of water around. And it's not just a pure reed stand. We've got quite a few other species which have now come in and are getting quite well established. One of the first ones that jumps out is the iris. There's quite a lot of iris around in the bed. And then if we look in further, there's this very long, straggly one, which is the water horsetail. This forms quite large areas within the bed. Lower down, if we go down a bit lower then, we run into the water mint, which is this broadleaf plant. And then as we get down further, we come into the start of the creeping plants. And what we've got down here is the start of the woody nightshade.
Moving further back still, the reed bed changes more dramatically as willow carr develops. Carr is a general name for a dense collection of bushes and trees. Sometimes there are quite sharp changes in the bed. To the left is mainly reed. To the right, plants typical of wet meadowland. The change occurs because this part of the bed is a little drier, and so different types of plants grow here. The further back we go, the drier it gets. Eventually, it's dry enough for grasses to flourish. Grassland is often managed as grazing for animals. The plants vary according to the degree of wetness. There's a change from grassland through reeds to the plants in the water itself. And that can make management of the reed bed difficult. But there's an even greater difficulty to contend with. The bed is also changing with time. You can see these changes happening in the reed bed. One end of the bed is silting up and drying out. At the other end, the reeds are pushing forward. If we stood still for tens or hundreds of years, the plants in front of us would slowly change. So keeping the reed beds as they are means doing something to slow down or stop these natural changes.
It would be very nice to leave them as they are, but what's going to happen is as soon as we leave them, then we're going to get this drying out process and the whole succession going on. So if we leave it 10, 20 years, we won't have reed beds anymore.
One answer may be to cut down the reeds. Then the next year, a pure crop of reeds would be produced, without any other plants. This might stop the bed changing, but won't it have an effect on the animals that live in the reed bed?
I think the way to do it is to start off and split the reed bed into 4 and do an area each year. So you've got a 4-yearly cycle going on, which means you've got an area of just cut reed, which is going to grow nice, tall and straight the next year. And also with the cycle, you've created a habitat for all the other animals which use it and birds that need the more sheltered environment.
Hopefully, a policy of regular harvesting will keep the reed bed as a worthwhile and varied part of the reserve. But the reed story doesn't end with the reserve. Some local people believe that mismanagement of the reed beds has led to a number of problems in the surrounding area.
These are fairly specific things that have occurred. We have a bad problem of flooding in our lower field. This has largely arisen because of drainage through the lee beds. The stream bed has become choked, bottling back the water. This has, in winter, certainly caused severe flooding.
This used to be the village cricket pitch. The relationship between the reserve and the surrounding farmers isn't particularly close.
I think this is a pity, actually. I don't think they really understand the problems of the farmers bordering the lee, and we certainly don't understand what their policy is towards the reserve. It is an area of outstanding natural beauty surrounded by farmland. They could think in much wider terms of doing more towards holidaymakers, maybe badger watches or photography courses or painting courses. This would bring a closer understanding about farming, farmers and the reserve.
So everybody seems to make conflicting demands on the reserve. For instance, the bird watchers would not be very happy with any changes, particularly to the reed beds. They see them as a favourite quiet spot for the birds. In particular, it's the variety of bird life which is important.
As well as the reed warblers, since 1976 we have had Chetty's warblers, which have colonised from across the channel. They're dynamic species which have crossed the channel and are now breeding in quite a few areas along the south coast, and Slapton is fortunately one of these areas.
In order to decide what ought to be done, the bird watchers must investigate the current position by catching some birds.
When you're taking birds out of the net, you start at the last thing that's gone into the net, which is the legs. So you free the legs first, and it's out.
These nets, mist nets, are so fine the birds cannot see them. Netting takes place most weekends in the summer and provides information about the bird life on the lee.
It's a juvenile sedge warbler because we've got this buffy coloured collar, and that will make it a bird of the year. Ring number is 04.
The ring will identify each bird if it's ever caught again. Over the years, the detailed written records have built up into a wealth of important recorded data.
63. And the weight on that is 11.3 grams. Those are the significant statistics we want to get from this bird. And it's got its ring on its leg, and we can now let it go.
It's become clear that reed beds and their surroundings are a vital habitat for many birds. They like the peace and quiet. They don't like to be disturbed. And the reed beds also provide a rich source of insects for food. But again, there's the problem because the reed beds are changing.
We've been operating here for 25 years now. The area has changed. The character of the leas have changed. Certainly the upper lea have changed quite a lot. We are losing a certain amount of pure reed bed, and we've got an awful lot of willow carr coming in and establishing itself, which does in fact alter the habitat quite considerably.
Birds prefer reeds. So from the birdwatcher's point of view, a good policy would be to get rid of a lot of carr and let pure reed grow back in its place. Unfortunately, that would be in direct conflict with some of the other interest groups. Margaret Wise studies otters. She has to push deep into the upper reaches to study the reserve's most secret inhabitants.
Slapton Lea is about the best habitat for otters in the south of Britain because it's not disturbed, because it's a nature reserve. Most of the area has floating islands associated with it, so the otters can just retreat to couches, which are dens above ground where they can lie up during the day, or they can have halts in the roots of trees like this one, for example, by the water, and they're not disturbed by people at all.
Otters just don't like people. Even the researchers don't see them very often, which makes studying otters particularly difficult. Otters have their own territories, and they mark these out to warn off other otters. The marking out is done by depositing their droppings, called spraints.
The only evidence we have that otters are actually here is from collecting spraint over the whole area and by looking at their tracks and also couches and halts where possible, and sometimes slides from the halt right down to the water. But really, they're very secretive mammals. They don't like being disturbed by people, so if they hear anyone around, they'll just slide into the water and you won't notice them at all.
So another problem is managing the reserve to conserve a habitat for the otters. But that could mean denying access to people.
I think man in Britain is the only natural enemy the otter now has. We've affected them quite a lot in the last few years, particularly by pollution, by otter hunting as an added stress, by fishing, just lining along riverbanks, by tidying up riverbanks, by stopping brambles coming down as a natural camouflage for them. Pollution, all these things are detrimental to otters, and so it's vital that you have some areas left, like Slapton, where the otters can still live.
Anything that's done on the reserve, greater access for people or a management policy for fish or reeds, might affect the otters. That's the heart of the problem in planning the management of a nature reserve and its surroundings. All the plants and all of the animals are part of the same system. Change one part of the system and it will have an effect somewhere else. And those effects are so complicated that as yet nobody is able to predict them.